Welcome to Dispatches, the official podcast for the Journal of the American Revolution. Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to another edition of Dispatches. I'm your host, Brady Kreitzer. Joining me today is author Chris Pearl, and he'll be discussing his new book, Declarations of Independence, Indigenous Resilience, Colonial Rivalries, and the Cost of Revolution. Chris, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
Chris, you're a first-time guest on the show. Tell us a little bit about your background.
Well, I'm an associate professor of history and chair of the history department at Lycoming College in Williamsport, Pennsylvania, where I teach early American history. I received my PhD at Binghamton University under Douglas Bradburn, who's now the CEO of Mount Vernon.
Chris, let's talk about your book a little bit. I always like to ask authors this question. What inspired you to write this book and to take on this topic?
That's a good question. So I've been at Lycoming College for about 10 years now. The college sits on the land that this book is about, and I've been incorporating a lot of the history of this area into my courses for about a decade. And I really thought that I could tell this story, and I thought it would be a good book, and especially because of all the different peoples and experiences that I could bring to bear to describe the American Revolution. And I think what really made me write the book was that it's a really fascinating story about the American Revolution from these different perspectives and experiences. And all of them sort of clashed, commingled, and maybe collided during the American Revolution to give us maybe a better vantage point of that conflict.
Chris, one of the major opening parts of your book, which I think was wonderful, by the way, is this discussion you have early on about events that take place at Jersey Shore, PA. Now, for those who aren't from Pennsylvania, there is actually a town in Pennsylvania called Jersey Shore. That's important. We set that aside. But could you talk about those events?
Yeah, sure. So there's a couple of different events that I describe in Jersey Shore. There's a modern one that's built on a past one. So if you were to go to Jersey Shore today on July 4th, 1776, you'd be experiencing what's called the tie dotting ceremony, where they would describe this moment where a group of squatters had met on the banks of Pine Creek right by Jersey Shore, and they supposedly declared their independence from Great Britain before Congress, or unaware of what Congress is doing, but essentially on the same day. This has received a lot of national and sort of statewide attention. They have historical markers, two of them. I don't know why two. They're sort of separated by time and place. But also, in 1949, you had Army engineers out of Maryland coming out with a mine detector trying to find this lost declaration. And so that memorialization is about an actual historical moment where there were a group of people. They didn't necessarily meet under an elm tree, but a group of people, group of squatters that had met and sort of debated independence on the plains of Pine Creek around July 4th, 1776. And they supposedly created or drafted their own declaration. I don't think that actually happened. The historical record basically suggests that they met because they were part and members of the Committee of Observation and Inspection during the early parts of the resistance movement. They were working on this thing called the May 15th resolution out of Congress, which they were debating the merits of independence, and they came together on the banks of Pine Creek. But nonetheless, the story endures. But we do have this group of squatters that met on the banks of Pine Creek to declare or at least debate independence, in which we know they sort of wholeheartedly supported based on the records coming from the area in the immediate period after independence.
Chris, could you talk a little bit about the early settlers of Pennsylvania? How did they view their right to the land, to use the land? You talk about fair play. Those are all important concepts. Talk about the first European settlers. How did they view this colony as their own?
Yeah, I think that Pennsylvania is in this really weird predicament because Pennsylvania is often described as the best poor man's country in the world. Right, and so you have this sort of vision of Pennsylvania as opening up this bountiful sort of landscape to American prosperity, and that's really written into the historical record. But what I think we find by the 18th century is many people that are immigrating to or have been born into Pennsylvania don't actually experience any of that bounty, don't actually experience this best poor man's country. It's more akin to what some have described as sort of Hobbesian hellscape. Is sort of it's nasty and brutish, and so many immigrants at the time and many people coming in and many people being born into Pennsylvania are striving to look for sort of land they can call their own. And where do you get that from? Many by the 1730s begin squatting on land of speculators, the proprietors, and especially indigenous people on the outskirts of each new sort of purchase by the colonial establishment. And this sort of escalates over the 1740s, 1750s. By the time we reach to the 1760s, after Fort Stanwix's treaty with the Haudenosaunee, that deeds away a great deal of what is considered modern-day Pennsylvania, we have a group of squatters that start to push beyond that purchase because of some conflicts with the proprietary government and with the British Empire. And they start setting up their own squatter republic, which they call fair play. And I think that concept of fair play was sort of rooted in an understanding of governance, where government actively worked to provide its citizens a sort of fair shake. The government is instituted for the benefit of the broader community, but also for, the individuals involved. And we can see that, I think, pretty clearly in the way the fair play settlers operated. So they set up their own little squatter republic. It doesn't have any written laws and etc., but we can see how they function in the court records, especially by the 1780s. That's been incorporated. Their fair play republic has been incorporated into the state to a certain extent. And if we look at that fair play system of government, we can clearly see that that vision of governance at work. So to settle in the area, not only did a person or a family need to get permission of the neighbors, but they needed to take that evidence to the fair play tribunal. So it's the fair play government worked as a tribunal on a rotation. And that granted the male head of household the sort of voting rights and the ability to serve on the tribunal. If a person left the property and left their property for an extended period or tried to place a tenant on that property without prior approval, then the Fair Play Tribunal sort of divested that right and handed it over to another, basically a rule against absentee landowners. And perhaps the best way to capture the meaning of fair play was a rule against, and during the Revolutionary War, when farmers in and around the fair play settlement, they were hoarding grain and then they were going to sell it outside of the community for higher prices. And so the fair play government gets together and they decree that they're going to take that grain by force, but actually pay a fair market price. Because what they started to say, these people were doing it before the poor were supplied. And therefore, from their perspective, they were operating against the needs of the larger community, particularly the poorer sort. And that was captured in the way that they explained government, the way they articulated what they thought was the sort of revolutionary ethos of 1776, where they said, the few may never have advantages for the sake of the many. And so I think that's, pretty clearly articulated there. But also, at the same time, they also wanted to make clear that they're not against, profit. That's one of the things that they pointed out very early on, is that, we're taking this grain, and we're also going to pay a fair market price, but we're not actually against profit. We're only against profit when it is to the detriment of the larger community, and particularly what they described as the poorer sort. And that for them was the essence of fair play. Who has access to the levers of power, who is included in the say of government, and who can benefit ultimately from that government that they create. So they're not anti-government people. They're very pro-government, just a particular kind of government, if that makes sense.
Yeah, these, Chris, of course, are themes we still see today, and this leads me to my next question. Certainly relevance to the 21st century as well as the 18th. What is the difference, in your opinion, between a squatter and a settler? Because this is a question of historical memory and perspective, depending who you ask. So how would you differentiate those two?
No, that's a great question. I think if you're thinking about settlers, it depends on how you describe them. And I think if you look at the memorialization of a lot of settlers, it's often described as pioneers, right? I mean, and pioneers is a complicated term. It's often used as a term for first explorers, first settlers. And that in and of itself, just the term we give it, discredits and sometimes erases indigenous existence, sovereignty, and etc. And so how do we grapple with pioneers in an area that is, particularly on the West Branch that I'm writing about, that's inhabited by native peoples claiming sovereignty over the same land? And I think that it's best. I mean, you can call them settler colonists, which I think broadly explains kind of what they're doing and kind of their designs, but you can also see them as squatters. They are squatters in and of itself is an illegal settlement on land, and in this case they're illegally squatting on indigenous land beyond the boundaries of a purchase from 1768, and they're doing so on purpose, but because they see this as a likely avenue to freehold land that they can hold on for the future and for their posterity. And that sort of matters because, as I describe it in the book, and I try to sort of lay out squatting, like what the process of squatting is, so you think of squatters as sort of the rippling waves in a pond, like if you throw a stone. So each new purchase, you have squatters sort of moving beyond the boundaries of each new purchase, trying to eke out some kind of subsistence, but also some kind of life for their posterity thereafter. And that's because the land laws in Pennsylvania and in the British Empire writ large largely favor those with connections, those that can actually purchase land when it's deeded from native peoples, whether that's by fraud, which is often, or legitimately.
So, Chris, you've introduced the concept of indigenous peoples, their viewpoints and perspectives. Who are some of these native peoples that you're researching, and how are they viewing this wave of settlement that's just an inescapable part of their life now?
Yeah, so the native peoples in my book are the Susquehanna Nations, which are a collection of refugee peoples, because my book starts in about 1749 when we're talking about the northern Susquehanna River Valley, and that starts by Sunbury, and it moves up the east branch, up to the north branch, and then up the west branch. And so that's the Lenape, the Shawnee, Nanticoke, Conoy, Tutelo, Saponi, and a host of Muskogean-speaking peoples. There's Haudenosaunee peoples. There's Mingo living in the area, and they're trying to come to terms with not only European settlement and European pressures on the land, but also the relationships between each other. So who has sovereign authority over this region of largely refugee peoples? Is it the Haudenosaunee who claims that land as the fruits of a victory from way back in the 17th century from the Beaver Wars? Is it the refugee peoples that are living on that land, many of whom collect together to resist Haudenosaunee sovereignty, but also British efforts to move into the land, and also French efforts early on to move into the land? And so they're pretty wary of any kind of movement into the territory because it brings dual problems. it's not just about European settlers and settler colonialism. I mean, that's a huge part of the problem, but it's who's going to accept that settler colonial process, who's negotiating with these Europeans. So largely the Europeans only want to deal with the Haudenosaunee, and so therefore many of these Lenape or Shawnee are pushed out or edged out of the negotiations. And so for them, a lot of the discussion and a lot of the debate over the northern Susquehanna River Valley is about not just the European settlers, but their own sovereign authority in the process. Are they able to negotiate the terms of land settlements? Are they able to reap the benefits or rewards from it? And are they able to dictate the terms of where settlement transpires? And from at least the 1740s, you can see that this is a constant problem in the northern Susquehanna River Valley. It sort of mirrors a little bit what's going on in the Ohio River Valley with the creation of the Ohio nations that's also resisting the same things. And so I think for many indigenous peoples, they're willing to accept, like if you read into the documents, they're saying, well, we're willing to accept some of these settlers. You know, some of them will actually negotiate for maybe a lease agreement between them and the European settlers, and maybe they're willing to do that. But they say, like pigeons, at least when one settles, 1,000 more may enter. And so they have to be very cautious about what they negotiate, who negotiates. And that's actually pretty problematic by the mid-18th century, especially when you bring in multiple European nations, multiple colonies that are jockeying for the same area, and multiple indigenous nations that claim sovereign authority over the area itself. And so what I describe in the book is there's this sort of diversity of interests that is trying to claim authority over the northern Susquehanna River Valley at the same time. And it's bleeding into the American Revolution as we sort of consider it and think about it, which should, if we sort of take it seriously what's happening there, sort of bring new events to the forefront and new things that we should think about when we discuss the American Revolution, its causes and its costs, I think.
Chris, whenever we talk about the politics of any people's, warfare is going to be a part of this time period. The 7 Years' War, of course, the Revolution. We always talk about patriotism, what drives the patriot cause, knowing these are sometimes very partisan groups. It's many groups. It's a coalition of sorts. Mm-hmm. What would you say are the driving real political motivations of the 18th century of these many different native nations you've mentioned?
I think for much of the latter half of the 18th century, you have your Ohio nations and your Susquehanna nations trying to establish their own independence and sovereignty in the regions they occupy, not only against advancing settler colonists and clashing European nations and colonies, but also from other indigenous nations, particularly the Six Nations or the Haudenosaunee, who see the Ohio peoples and the Susquehanna peoples as subject nations. Tributaries in a sort of an extensive and rather intricate network of indigenous peoples that existed throughout much of eastern North America, which the Haudenosaunee dubbed, the part of the covenant chain. By the 1740s, that chain had been stretched pretty much to its limits, and there were multiple indigenous nations attempting to remove themselves from it and claim their own independence and sovereign status. Many of whom found common cause with other subject peoples, forming connections, alliances, and confederations to achieve their own ends. The Ohio nations were one of these collections. The Susquehanna nations, which I write about in the book, are another significant collection of people, and they lived in these places that were ultimately under threat by settler colonists, by speculators, by imperial agents, and they're really trying to enter into this divisive political and diverse political environment with multiple interests at play. And so you have to realize that it's really sort of a complex situation. So if you're resisting, settler colonists, for example, so squatters on the land, that might actually give you some credibility in the mind of the provincial government and some of the speculators that they have in their interests. But they're also angling after the same land, so it's a very sort of delicate balance that many of them are trying to walk in diplomatically in this period. That's becoming much more difficult as the 18th century progresses. We can see this very clearly in the 1749 when they're negotiating for parts of the northern Susquehanna River Valley and sort of what the provincial government can have, what they cannot have, where they can settle, right? And how they're dealing with settler colonists on the ground, which is very different. How the provincial government is sort of looking at it and saying, well, we can use, some of these squatter claims, but also work against those squatters to achieve our own ends. It's nobody's working in tandem, but it's all telling a very clear story. There's a very clear trajectory moving forward if we play those stories out, right? So if we look at each one and how they're working with each other, and that's something I tried to do in the book, because otherwise, what we have is maybe we're only focusing on one group. Like I could have written a book on just the squatters, but I didn't do that because I was like, well, the squatters are very much impacted by this thing over here, so this, like speculators in the area. Well, now if I bring them in, then I have to bring in a host of other peoples to sort of think about what's actually going on. I hope that makes sense, right? Because if you think about it, you're like, wow, there's all of these peoples trying to figure out and have different agendas and different visions of the future for this one place. And how do we tell that story as an historian where we're trying to take a complex thing and make it so we can comprehend it for a much broader audience and a broader sort of experience and sort of telling that story. It's like, well, this is a perfect sort of microcosm of what people are experiencing beyond just the northern Susquehanna River Valley, but throughout, I think, the frontier areas.
There's so many people involved on the ground. As you mentioned, the complexities really our biggest hurdle. But we also have to remember there's an imperial body involved here.
Oh,
so
yeah, for sure.
Adds another layer of complication. Chris, could you tell us about the Treaty of Fort Stanwix? I think that's, very important but not well understood. It really changes a lot for the story.
Yeah, I think, the Treaty of Fort Stanwix of 1768, so not the 1784 one, which is equally important, right? But for me, the 1768 Treaty of Fort Stanwix should be right up there with the Stamp Act. It should be right up there with the Townsend Duties and the way that we explain the coming of the American Revolution, because it unleashes a lot of forces in early America that rarely do we explore. But for the audience, if we're thinking about it, we know the King George III's proclamation line of 1763, which bars settlement west of the sort of Appalachian Mountains. We have forts set up that King George III says that he's going to pay for and sort of provide some sort of support. But by 1768, there's the population of colonial Pennsylvania, but the colonies in general is doubling every 20 years. They're moving westward, northward, southward, and they're pushing beyond the boundaries and really pushing against the proclamation. Not only settlers, but also speculators. There's other companies involved and imperial agents that want to see this sort of dividing line expanded. One of the people that wants to see this expand is Sir William Johnson, who's the superintendent of Indian Affairs of the North. So if you think of anything north of where the Ohio reaches the Mississippi, that's part of his jurisdiction. But he's also working in tandem with the colonies within that spectrum. So Pennsylvania and New York, and mostly Pennsylvania and New York. Johnson doesn't really want to deal with Connecticut. He doesn't really want to deal with much of the New England colonies. He wants to deal with those that can offer him some sort of benefit. Pennsylvania, by and large, can offer him a much larger benefit than any others, and I think this is largely underexplored as well. That Johnson has a series of land deals with the Mohawk and with the Oneida that King George III's proclamation line effectively outlaws. And he's looking to actually achieve recognition of those, which requires pushing the dividing line to pushing the proclamation line a bit west. And he sees that in Thomas Penn, who's the proprietor of Pennsylvania, who actually tells him that if Johnson is able to push the line west, that Penn will actually work on his behalf in London to achieve what Johnson wants. There's a sort of quid pro quo there. That's one thing I think that's really important about Fort Stanwix. There's a lot of behind-the-scenes and backroom deals that are happening to basically achieve the movement of a line. But there's also, at the same time, colonial rivalries at play. So Pennsylvania wants to use Fort Stanwix, deal with the Haudenosaunee, to extend the line, to show that they have legal authority or sovereign authority over a large swath of territory in the northern Susquehanna River Valley particularly. And that's because Connecticut is claiming most of northern Pennsylvania as their own. And if Penn can get it in writing that the Haudenosaunee mostly or only want to deal in the area that Penn envisions as part of Pennsylvania with the Penns, then he has a legal argument against the Connecticut Purchase of the Susquehanna Company that he's been dealing with since the Albany Congress. And then we have some other real things going on with Fort Stanwix, like the fact that in Fort Stanwix there's a lot of very clear connections involved in how we extend the line. So Pennsylvania gets an outsized role, but then who gets to benefit from an actual purchase in that area? And who actually gets to deal? So Sir William Johnson excludes Connecticut, for example, but he also excludes the Susquehanna nations. So he's going to exclude the Shawnee, who he calls silly people. He's going to exclude the Lenape. He's going to exclude the Tutelo, Nanticoke, Conoy, to benefit the Haudenosaunee, who claim sovereign authority over the territory, which is in dispute in that period. So that's under question. And then you have at the end of it, and I think this is the most important part of the Fort Stanwix Treaty, is that once that they make a deal extending the line to the west, which would go up Lycoming Creek, which on the West Branch is just east of the Fairplay settlement, and down to the Ohio Territory, reaching the Tennessee River. Once you do that, the colonial government of Pennsylvania gets ultimate authority how to sell the land. And there's this mad scramble for land in the Susquehanna River Valley. Well, how is it parceled out? Well, one of the ways it's parceled out is that the head of the land office in Pennsylvania opens it on February 3rd at midnight without any public advertisement and only to speculators. So 40,000 acres in a matter of hours is dealt out to 24 people. And then when it's open to the public, it's not open until April 21st, and they get what's left. And what we see is many of the people that petition for and apply for land and are ultimately denied become squatters post-1769 in the northern Susquehanna River Valley as well as the Ohio Valley. And I just chose to focus in the book on what happens in the northern Susquehanna River Valley on the West Branch beyond the new purchase. So where that new purchase ends, what happens in the scenario of the aftermath of Fort Stanwix, the consequences of Fort Stanwix.
Yeah, Chris, we see decades of discussions and agreements made. The American Revolution kind of turns all of that on its head in a way. Unexpected calamity for the British Empire. Could you talk about how the Revolution changes a lot of this?
I think that the Revolution changes it because there's a lot of dialogue about who can access the levers of power, who can be included in the governmental structure, who can be included in decision making, who's going to benefit ultimately from land, I think. That discussion happens very early on. If we look at some of the stuff that Congress puts out, if we look at some of the stuff that the states or the colonies come states put out, it's a lot about Western land. They're also talking about, parliamentary grievances and etc., but they couch it in such a way that it is about who has access, who's included, who has a say. And these are questions that have been roiling, I think, many of the colonies for decades, and sort of comes to a head. And if we look in the northern Susquehanna River Valley and we look at some of the squatters there, they actually see what they even say is common cause with Congress, common cause with the state, as they're sort of articulating the very feelings and the very sentiments that many of them expressed for decades. So I think it gives voice to a segment of the population that really harnesses it and carries it through the revolution. And so if we look at particular spaces in the revolution, we can see how people use it, but we can also see how they are used. And that's the other thing I wanted to show. It's like, okay, so we have these fair play settlers that use a lot of revolutionary rhetoric, and they use this language of the common cause very clearly. They literally say the common cause, and we are involved, right? Not only against, this is a quote from them, not only against a British army, but against a savage enemy, right? Like, it's right up there with Parkinson's sort of vision of the common cause, right? So you're like, there it is. But at the same time, they are used. And so they start to become very clearly popular in the newspapers and the public record. They receive commendations from Congress, who is struggling to establish its own sovereign authority, right, over a vast territory, from the state, who is also trying to establish its sovereign authority against a host of characters at the same period. And I think that if we only take a snapshot of, let's say, 76 to 1784, we miss a big chunk of the story of why people are acting in the particular ways that they're acting in 76, 77, 78. And ultimately what the costs of those actions are beyond 1784 as well. So one of the things that I really want to do is expand the timeline out and say, well, let's contextualize what's going on here through a very clear story of one particular area. So we can tell a very complex story, but one that reveals these diversity of interests and the way they play out and the way that they are used by political actors throughout the 1770s, 1780s, and even into the 1790s.
So, Chris, we always end with the same question on this program. I think it gets to the heart of what we do as historians. How do you think your book helps us understand the Revolutionary Era better?
Oh, God.
No pressure, right? Easy question.
No, it's a very difficult question. I think by focusing on the area that I focus on helps us confront what I think is the complicated dynamics between settlers and indigenous nations and its fundamental place in the American Revolution. So the drive for settler independence often came at the expense of native sovereignty and territorial rights. So by placing, and this is something I do in the book, is place indigenous resistance alongside settler assertions of freedom, we can offer maybe a more nuanced or honest portrayal of the era, one that acknowledges the overlapping and often conflicting claims to land and autonomy. The Revolutionary Era, from my perspective, wasn't a singular, straightforward struggle for liberty, but a contested, sort of multifaceted transformation that shaped the future of both settlers and indigenous peoples. I think, too, my book helps us grapple with the power of land in the American Revolution, but also, and this is something, it's sort of subtle in the book, but what I wanted to promote is the idea of generational grievances in the shaping of people's decisions and actions in the Revolutionary Era. Both the Fair Play settlers and the Susquehanna nations were making decisions based on a much longer history and experiences that had spanned and was passed down through generations. Those generational experiences and grievances did not simply go away with the American Revolution or the end of the war. They very much continue to shape people for years to come. One of the things I bring up in the book, and the most prominent of which that you can see, one is on the flip side. In the 1750s, I talk about Tedious Gung and then his son Captain Bull and the generational grievances there. But after the American Revolution, we have in 1790 the murder of two innocent Seneca men by the Walker brothers, who were the descendants of a Revolutionary War veteran, a Fair Play Tribunal member. And they're never prosecuted for their crimes. In fact, the community hides them from both federal and state investigations. They live out the last days in their life in Indiana, never being punished for the crimes that they've committed. But they declared that their actions were based on revenge for the murder of their father, which happened during the American Revolution, during what's popularly known as the Lee Massacre, which is still memorialized as a state historical marker to this day. And then one of the men that's caught, their accomplice Samuel Doyle, is acquitted of all charges because the community, the jurors, found he had there was no fault. He's acquitted of everything. And those jurors were Revolutionary War veterans, but they're also members of that now extinct Fair Play Republic. And so what we can see from that is that sort of memory of the Revolution, and that memory and those experiences and generational ones don't just go away magically with the end of the Revolutionary War, but continue to shape the trajectory of the early Republic, the creation and transformation of the state of Pennsylvania. And it's going to do that elsewhere. I mean, this is not an aberration. This is a story that exists throughout, I think, the United States. There's plenty of places that have similar foundational stories that we need to unpack, and this is just one of them. I think that I'm doing. There's plenty of others that are happening at the same time.
Chris Pearl, thank you very much for joining us tonight.
Thank you very much for having me. I really appreciate it.